Hello, this is John O'Shea. I'm going to go through how to answer the OCR Gothic question, the comparative question. And this is question 2 of paper 2. This is worth 30 marks. And this is how the question is set out. You usually get a quote like this: transformations are at the heart of Gothic. And this statement that comes underneath the quote is always written this way in the exam. Consider how far and in what ways you agree with the statement, comparing Dracula and the Bloody Chamber stories. So you're expected to compare, and you're expected to come up with a number of ways of looking at that quote. Okay, we need to start with what the assessment objectives are for this question. Now, 50% of this answer will be on the contexts. So you've got to consider trying to get at least one context into every paragraph that you write to explain why the text is the way it is. This is a Battenberg cake. It's really sweet. Now we see it's 4 parts, and in some ways this is the way you should tackle this question. Try to see the question in 4 different ways if possible, 4 different interpretations. So if transformations are at the heart of Gothic, agree with that. Look at what kind of transformations. So have different types of transformations for each square. Perhaps consider where transformations are not at the heart of Gothic, but perhaps restoration could be at the heart of Gothic, so that people are, rather than transformed, they are restored back. So you're still dealing with the question, but you're breaking it apart. You're agreeing with some parts of the quote, disagreeing, seeing the quote in new ways. And so try to come up with 4 different ways. Okay, 3 is the magic number. Don't just make one point and then compare with your secondary text. Try to always aim to say 3 different things about your text before you compare with your secondary text, and keep that in mind. Okay, let's take the question. Transformations are at the heart of Gothic. So let's agree with that. And let's look first of all at, well, what kind of transformations? Let's deal solely with physical transformations. Okay. So naturally, we could talk about how Lucy is transformed. So in a vampiric state, she becomes much more animalistic, and you can talk about all of the idea of her licking her lips, and that Dracula unleashes some kind of animalistic element to her. But not only her, Mina is changed physically as well. The stain on her forehead, because she didn't want to hinder Dracula. So even though she's a teacher of etiquette, she has propriety. She acts with propriety all the way through. She is transformed by Dracula as well. Characters are physically transformed. Jonathan's hair turns grey overnight with the shock. And so Dracula himself is an old man who's then transformed into a young man through the taking of blood. So physical transformations are at the heart of this Gothic. What is the context we could bring into this? The fear of foreigners, the fear of Dracula, unleashing sexual desires. This plays on those end of century, these fantasiac anxieties about immigration and about the national blood being contaminated. And so we try and bring in a context to explain these transformations at some point. Then we can consider our secondary text, perhaps the Tiger's Bride. At the end of this story, the bride, the girl, her skin is licked off. He licks off her skin, releasing the animal inside. Now, the contrast here is that sexuality is not seen as a negative animalistic sexuality here by Carter, but rather as a celebration rather than a criticism. So then you can explain that contrast by means of Carter's intentions. As a second wave feminist, she's trying to release women from perhaps the captivity of how their sexuality has been seen as a bad thing. She sees it as a natural thing, and that could explain the difference between the 2 texts. So at heart, this exam question is asking you to consider your texts in different ways from the focal point of transformations. So let's consider how the texts actually transform the genre in which they're written in. This could be a straightforward comparison also. Okay, let's take the Gothic novel. How does Stoker transform that genre? Well, he has Harker as the traditional victim, where it's usually a female role. So at the start of the novel, you could look at how this male is placed within the gender reversals have taken place. The females become the predators. Animalistic, that dominance, powerful. These all add to this horrifying Victorian view of female vampirism. Stoker sort of changes things around to what people have been used to in reading Gothic novels. But he also changes the Gothic novel and incorporates different aspects of the detective novel. He's playing on the popularity of Sherlock Holmes, written around the same time. And so we get this kind of characters looking for clues to decipher and to find out where Dracula is. We've got the traditional use of the epistolary novel. We've got extracts of journalism. So this isn't a straightforward Gothic novel, but it incorporates different genres within it. It's a very modern novel in that respect. So what context could we bring in to explain this? Perhaps this idea of, these dominant role reversals. It's seen perhaps as a horrifying thing, that vampirism distorts the social order, creates a terrifying vision of a world in which men are subordinate to women in a sexual way. Perhaps Stoker's views on sexual desire being seen as harmful could be used as a contextual point here. And bringing in your genre awareness of different kinds of novels is also context. Now your comparison with the Bloody Chamber here could be looking at how Carter transforms fairy stories. Why does she use fairy stories? Well, these are told to young girls and they give messages about patriarchal dominance in which girls are rescued by men. That stories end in happy ever after, where women, their story ends on marriage, and that's the aim of everything. So it makes sense that this feminist would transform the genre of fairy stories. So of course you could take an example. I don't have the books to hand, but I've got a few quotes. The werewolf story, she knew she was nobody's piece of meat. So here the transformation of the girl victim and the werewolf is transformed. She is not going to be a victim. And again, the transformation in the Bloody Chamber, where the mother rescues the daughter. So we could bring in that context there of the fairy story, how Carter deliberately changes this specific genre, because perhaps the stories and the archetypes that it frames are not conducive to a feminist message. Okay, new argument, new paragraph. Let's consider the question again that's at hand. The transformations are at the heart of Gothic. Well, this time we might argue that, yes, transformations happen, but they're not permanent, that people are restored back to how they originally were. So these are just merely temporary things. This allows us another argument that takes us down another route. Okay, sometimes it's good to alter what text you start with. So we've started with Dracula for the first two times. Maybe we should focus this time on the Bloody Chamber stories, because remember, you have to deal with both texts equally. So let's consider where transformations happen, but they're not permanent. We could argue that the pianist in the Bloody Chamber, her transformation is permanent, perhaps. She does carry the mark of shame on her forehead. That's an interesting question. Why? Are women made to feel guilty for what for their own desires? Is Carter saying that society places guilt upon women that's never taken away? Do women force themselves to feel guilty for what they've done? the three wives in that story, they are transformed into permanent monuments of the Marquis's depravity. They die with a smile on their face, and they are not changed. They are not brought back to life. The Snow Child, she ends with a drop of blood. She doesn't come back. The vampire is transformed into a human, and she dies. And ultimately, she's transformed into and there's the symbol of a flower. She's transformed into this flower. The girl in Mr. Lion becomes full of vanity, but she's not transformed permanently. Her vanity stays with her, but then she learns to think of others. She changes. So we could argue that in some stories, transformation is permanent, but in some stories, it isn't permanent. And I suppose the context that we can bring in are perhaps the literary context here, the use of symbolism, the mark of Cain, sort of references to other texts. This is literary criticism, literary context that you can bring in. The Marquis is obviously a reference to a real-life character, the Marquis de Sade, so another historical context that you can bring in there. So we're looking at some transformations are permanent and some are not. You're comparing and contrasting. You're not always looking for similarities, but differences. So we've looked at where some transformations are permanent. The pianist's mark of shame, that's permanent. But you could contrast that with Mina's mark. Her mark disappears. Well, why? Because Mina's good. Why? Well, Victorians demand a neat closure to their stories. Gothic fiction in Victorian times seems to be pretty moral in many ways. Mina's mark disappears because her goodness is rewarded. So it's a kind of clear-cut sense of good and evil in the novel, and so Mina has to be rewarded with that. Whereas Carter says that things are not quite clear-cut in gender issues. Dracula's ending is kind of interesting. If you look at the ending of Dracula, does he end as a vampire, or is he transformed before his actual death? It might be worth looking at the last page and looking at the description of that. In the same way that Dracula, his dominance over Lucy is only temporary. In death, she's restored to the beautiful, good Lucy, the moral Lucy. So transformations do happen, but they're not necessarily permanent. And maybe the context that we bring out of that is this idea that Gothic novels are moral, that sin is punished and order ultimately is restored, and that transformations are not necessarily always permanent. Okay, so if we consider our Battenberg cake with 4 parts of it, let's consider a third part. We've looked at the transformations from a physical point of view. We've looked at the transformations of genre. Now let's consider the transformations in both texts from the point of view of power dynamics, particularly of gender power dynamics. So let's start with Dracula. Mina, as the novel goes on, one could argue, becomes central to finding Dracula. Her skills, her man's brain, her sort of supernatural connection with Dracula gives the team the ability to track Dracula down. So she becomes stronger as the novel goes on, one could argue. She becomes a strong mother figure to different characters, to Arthur, who cries and weeps on her shoulder. She kind of builds up Jonathan again. So what kind of context is this? Perhaps Stoker is hinting at this new woman, that women no longer are just merely victims in a Gothic novel, but they have a sort of positive role to play, that they can grasp new technologies, and they can take on new opportunities. Perhaps one could argue that Stoker is a more enlightened writer as a result. Your essay can contradict what you've said previously. and that's perfectly fine. And you could find examples of that. Now we could contrast that perhaps with the Lady in the House of Love story. In this story, the virgin male should be the victim. He's entering the house of a vampire, and we expect him to become the victim of this vampire, but rather he becomes the savior. And why is that? He doesn't see her as a sexual object. He sees her rather like a child to be protected, and perhaps not seeing her through the traditional male gaze, not objectifying her, according to Laura Mulvey, is what actually saves him. Perhaps Carter is saying that if men view women not merely as sexual objects, then it's healthier for everyone, one could argue. So his ability to save her is through his ability not to objectify her. And so you could bring in that context there of the male gaze. She transforms into a human and dies, while Lucy becomes stronger as a vampire. So we could see two different contrasts here. Someone who, in giving up her vampirism, is released from a prison and perhaps willingly dies a human. Whereas Lucy, one could argue, is released from the prison of being a constrained woman and embraces her full sexuality. Maybe if you took a modern feminist view of the text, of seeing the text as a different reader over time, one could argue that Lucy is fully free only when she's a vampire, because in Victorian society, women are constrained and imprisoned by the patriarchal society. So you could look at that kind of context of how readers see texts over time. Now, both texts are dealing with female vampires. This isn't something new. You can refer back to your knowledge of previous novels that dealt with female vampires. Carmilla, for example. Bram Stoker would have known the writer of Camilla, Lefroy, I think. Now, why did they create female vampires? Is there something more horrific to have the softer sex, if you like, from a male perspective? Is it more horrific to have a vampire as a female? Does it play on fears of female sexuality? That's for you to think about. Okay, so you're getting towards the end of your hour to answer this question. Now, remember what the question will always say. Consider how far and in what ways, plural ways. So towards the end of your essay, you might be running out of time. Try to mention other ways or other readings of seeing this question of transformation. These are some of them that I might consider and might briefly touch upon. Religion plays a part in transforming people. Now, in Dracula, religion defeats Dracula and so transforms Dracula at the end, and Lucy, in a good way, perhaps one could argue, back into humans. But religion has the opposite effect on Wolf Alice. It makes her feel shame for her body, for having periods, for her animal-like state. Before that, she didn't feel any shame. And so religion has transformed her. Maybe Carter is making a critical point about what religion does to us. So transformations can be seen as positive in the Bloody Chamber stories, while negative in Dracula. Why? Well, perhaps Carter wants society to change in many ways, and she illustrates that through her stories. Whereas maybe a white middle-class male like Bram Stoker is fearful of change at the end of the 19th century. And you could give an illustrative example of that. Now, what other changes have we not explored? We haven't really looked at maybe psychological change. We could briefly look on that. The Lady in the House of Love is changed not just physically into a human, but she sees another life. She doesn't want to be a vampire. She wants to exit that. She wants to come out of her cage, and through death, she has that freedom. So through returning to being a human, she is let out of her prison. Whereas you could argue that Mina, at the end of the novel, is married to Jonathan, has a child. she returns back into the prison. If you see it from perhaps a feminist modern reading of it, that Mina is no longer going to be so free to help. She's going to be returned to the domestic sphere to be a mother. Final point you could make, perhaps think about not just the text, but the readers of the text, AO5. Real transformation happens with the reader. Perhaps the real fear in Dracula is that of women rather than of vampires. Perhaps a modern reader looking back on Dracula and looking back at how central sexuality is to the novel might suggest that what the novel is really terrified of is that women taking control over their sexuality. Maybe that might not have been the immediate thought of the Victorian reader. So that's the end of it, really. I hope this gives you a brief idea of how you can kind of pick apart the quote, support parts of it, see the quote in different ways, perhaps challenge parts of the quote, bring in different contexts every time. Every paragraph should be bringing in context because it's 50%, and try to show at least 3 different points of evidence before you compare with your second text. Try to deal with both texts equally. Okay, good luck.